And in 1908, there was a lot of rain in Vancouver, more than we had today, certainly. And this whole area flooded, and all the buildings that were built around here, they pretty much all washed into the creek here, down into Falls Creek. Willow at the very base there was a huge 60-foot trench, right? And so it was filled with a bunch of refuge after that big flooding, and so basically from that point onward, it was just being used as a big refuse dump. But it wasn't the kind of garbage dump that we had today. There's no plastics or electronics. I mean, this is just people's old food scraps and stuff like that. So it wasn't as harmful as we think. So that not long after that, this was turned into a reservoir, Little Mountain. That's our reservoir there. It's just been upgraded a little while ago. And pretty much as soon as that was turned into a reservoir, the creeks that are around this area, and this one in particular, pretty much turned into a trickle. And that's when the development started to happen. Much longer, much earlier before that, this was a swamp, right? As it says in the title of this tour. And the reason for that, some enterprising little beaver, let's call him Billy, built a dam, as was common all throughout North America at one time, just around where Heather Park is there. And so this flooded, and after it ceased to be a swamp, over a period of about 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years, all this organic matter starts to decay, the trees start to fall in, and it turned into one big peat bog, right? A muskeg, some people refer to it. And this was prime grazing ground for elk, right? Large elk would come into this area, and it would be a bounty. And elk, we consider them to be fairly solitary, but they would come in big groups, 30, herds, about 30 people. Please.
How much of the area would you say was covered by?
The interesting thing is, not much further than Douglas Park itself, right? The interesting thing about most of the parks you see in Vancouver at all, most of them were swampy land, unfit for building on. So it's interesting, like when this was built in I can't remember, the 60s, 70s, this is just a waiting pool. I have fond memories of coming here as a child, but when this was built, you could smell that old, rotting organic matter from thousands of years ago, pretty much all around the park and a few blocks away. So it's really, really stinky. If you'll notice, any development in this area, the type of soil is much different than anywhere else, where it's more of a clay or like a red-like material in other parts of Vancouver. A bit more stinkier. So you've got like T Swamp. I think there's actually maybe a tour of T Swamp Park. That's one such example down Brewery Creek. Now, it probably likely wasn't a settlement per se, but First Nations people, First Nations women in particular, would probably come here and pick berries. This place, being a swamp and being so rich in organic matter, was great for things like medicinal plants and berries and things of that nature. All that changed in 1858. 1858, gold was found out in the Caribou there. And so, all these miners and all these fellas from out east and from the States and from Asia and what have you came going through here, and that's basically when the elk in Greater Vancouver went into extinction. One miner, an enterprising Scotsman, a adventurous guy by the name of William Pitcairn Mackey. He was in San Francisco at the time when he got wind of this gold rush, so he got out here with his panning gear, and he wasn't so fortunate. There's never as much gold as everyone likes to believe there is. And so pretty soon you had men all over this area, mostly men, pretty much destitute and looking for work. So he took up logging, First it was the gold, then it was the coal, First we thought it was coal, hence coal harvest. Then we came to the trees, and these trees were shipped off to help the navies of Europe destroy one another. So this guy, he didn't have much luck with gold. Now, while he was logging, he struck up a friendship with a guy by the name of Jeremiah Rogers. Now, you may know Jerry Rogers for his namesake. Anyone know? Jericho Beach, a.k.a. Jerry's Cove. Nothing to do with the Battle of Jericho, I think. Jericho is a corruption of Jerry's Cove, right, which is interesting to know, which was his original logging camp. Now, Pitcairn and Mackey were a great team. Jeremiah Rogers was known as the greatest woodsman of them all. He was quite an entrepreneur. together with Mackie, they would pull these huge spars out, and some of the best were up by Queen Elizabeth Park there. Very few original trees there in the park. And they would pull them out down on log skids, down heather there, into Mackay Creek, right here. And they would do this with teams of 12, 14 oxen, all just hoisting them out. Now, being an entrepreneur, he eventually also adopted a steam engine to help him out. So they have this like tiny little locomotive pulling together with these oxen. And at one time, he also employed camels, which I think is great. Just this idea of camels coming through Douglas Park at one time or another, also alluding to perhaps Egypt in some way or another. I find them very reliable. Anyways, this land was great for grazing his oxen, right? He's like, all this pasture here, they pretty much took over where the elk left off. And Mackay, he's like, you know what? I want to set up shop here. And so he did. In 1860, the government of Canada, wanting to stem the tide of invasive Americans, not looking at you, right? They wanted people to start planting food, and so they allowed any person of European descent to preempt up to 160 acres, pretty much anywhere they liked, right? As long as it wasn't already a native settlement, right? And so Mackay, he put pegs down. He started went from Oaks across 24th, right, down Tupper Lane, Tupper Street, whatever you want to call it, all the way to the alley between 15th and 16th Avenue, and then back again. All whopping 160 acres. Hence, also, once again, all the irregular jogs in the system that you might see here, all the irregular blocks. Now, unfortunately, that also meant that was the last of any native entitlement to this land by BC law, right? So even though it was used, because it wasn't a proper settlement, it was like, this is my land now kind of thing. So he would use here to graze his oxen. Then, let's see here. The only way you could preempt the land is if you promised to improve the land by cultivating things. And so, how did Mackay do that? He planted some potatoes. Yeah, just a land of potatoes, as many people did. I mean, they didn't really take the whole preemption law very seriously. People would be squatting on land for years, and eventually they would be allowed to buy it and then buy other land. So it's interesting to note what is done. Now, eventually, Mackay's nephew, took over. Another Mackay, another Bill Mackay, and this time he planted a full garden over there. Now, this switched hands several times. It eventually got into the hands of a Jessie Hall, one of the few women on this tour. Jessie Hall was the widow of Vancouver's first notary public. And she was actually the first white woman to be born up in the Cariboo. And she was born into poverty. And then she married into a very, very rich family and was bequeathed this land that we now stand upon. She, from about 1908 to the 1920s, rented this land out to a person by the name of Mu, who was one of the first Chinese people in this land. And this land, even up into the 60s, it still had the reputation of being known as the Chinese Gardens or Market Gardens. And they planted a bunch of vegetables of all sorts of varieties right along the western edge there. Like I said, very fertile ground, this area. And the thing about that, so there was Mu and all his workers, probably from Guangdong province, they would use this land and they would wrap their vegetables in paper and they would sell them to people here. It was the first market garden south of False Creek. Now, the interesting thing is, there were racial covenants on all the plots here. So every day, Mu and his gang had to hike all the way back down to False Creek, possibly, or maybe even Chinatown itself, and then back up again. And these racial covenants, believe it or not, they lasted up into the 1980s, and then they were all changed at an expense. And you'd be surprised how many racial covenants are still on lots of land in Vancouver. A lot over, mostly on the west side here. Most people, of course, don't consider them holding any value, but there are all sorts of weird laws that are still on the books in Vancouver.